The technology controls the position and speed of a car in a single lane, but only up to speeds of 60 kilometres per hour. That's the BBC News.
Albania is one of the poorest countries on the European continent, but its men were gripped by gambling addiction. Debt, divorce and suicide rates became so high the government took drastic action and banned gambling. I'm Dr. Heather Wardle. And a passion for sport are driving a billion-dollar industry that's normalising gambling. In the second episode of this three-part Compass series, I'm looking in depth at Albania's gambling industry. In 2019, the government banned gambling online and closed 4,000 betting shops. Only a handful of high-end casinos are still open.
It was destroying families, and it was having a horrific effect on young people and people who could not stop. It was a lot of suicides and families destroyed because of gambling.
I think gambling should be strictly regulated, but I really want to find out if gambling can bring any benefits. So in each programme, I'm setting somebody a mission to show me why gambling is important to their country. Fationa Magini is a journalist based in Tirana, the capital city of Albania. She specialises in writing about Albania's development and has been looking at the consequences of the gambling ban. I met up with her over Zoom.
Hello.
Hi, it's really nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you and see you.
This meeting is being recorded.
In gambling in Albania.
I mean, this is a history that is quite interesting. For more than 4 decades, Albania has been a dictatorship and a communist regime. So gambling was considered a criminal act back then. The legalization of gambling happened in 1991. Sports betting and other gambling entities, including casinos, started to become very much present in the country. They started to pop up in every street corner. The gambling, as a result, became very widespread in the country.
And you said it popped up on every high street. In what way did it pop up? How was that provided?
What we will have will be these sports betting shops. They become like so people will get together, they will have coffee or drinks, and at the same time they will watch football, and in the same time they will gamble. We have seen also an increase in the compulsive gamblers as well. All these kind of like environments started to incite domestic violence and led many couples to divorce.
Is this why the government took such a drastic step to ban gambling? How does the ban work?
The full ban of gambling, besides casinos and the National Lottery, caught many by surprise. In his speech, the Prime Minister mentioned a series of reasons, and one of the reasons was around 70% of those playing started this activity in the age from 10 to 15 years old. Showed that 1 in 4 players has done at least one would spend around 700 million euros each year in gambling. So this is a really big sum, and the country having one of the lowest GDP per capita in the European continent. One other reason, it was mentioned that part of this sector was financed by organized crime.
So the government took really bold action in doing this. But how have ordinary people reacted to this?
As a result of these bans, we have 4,000 gambling shops throughout Albania that were closed. And at least 8,000 people lost their jobs. This was not easy also for the state budget, because it is estimated that the state budget has lost around 40 million euros from the taxation of this sector.
And those men you talked about who were really into what are they doing now?
I mean, this is a good question. I think they are gambling again. We are not living anymore in communism. And so in this open world, and also in the moment that you have internet, it is a little bit like, nonsense to ban something like gambling. What has changed is that the problem is not visual anymore. So you cannot go to the streets and see these betting shops. But in fact, underground, Everything is happening as it was in the past.
And who's organising these illegal betting establishments?
In the majority of the cases, there are the same people that were having these formal gambling shops. They just have transferred their business from legal to illegal.
I mean, I'm astonished that a country that had no history of legal gambling prior to 1991 suddenly had 4,000 neighbourhood betting shops in the course of 30 years. When I put that by comparison to, say, Albania is quite similar in size and population to Wales in Great Britain. In Wales, we have 300 betting shops, not 4,000 betting shops. And then to suddenly come in and take this drastic action where all of a sudden everything is banned, it's really, really bold. So I will be so interested to hear more about the situation in Albania. But what I really want to know from you, Fationa, is what is it that you want to find out?
Was this a decision that was well thought, or it was something that the government rushed into that? Through banning the gambling, you have shifted a sector that was legal and you could control that. I think it's dangerous. It's a sunny, wintry day in central Tirana in Wilson Square. 2 years ago, before the gambling ban, there have been many betting shops around this area. Now, many of them have remained closed and way to meet Nesti Bircha. For almost 20 years, he worked in the gambling sector. Now I'm really wondering what he's doing. Përshëndetje Beni, si je? Si kanë shkuar punët?
So there were two casinos here, into a pizzeria, the other into a coffee place. Further down the street there were two other casinos. One is now a pastry shop, the other is a clothing store. Here, just on the roundabout, there was another casino, but that building has been demolished. Family lost their livelihoods.
How difficult this last 2 years?
Very difficult, very hard indeed. I had to go to work abroad. Nobody would hire me at my age. Everybody just told me, we don't have any work for you. So I went abroad to work.
In your opinion, what were the real reasons behind the ban?
I don't really know why they closed them down, but they said that it was because there were requests from people, from families to do so. Because there was an increase in the number of players and people got poorer, the divorce rate started to grow.
Now I'm in Selit, southern neighborhood of Tirana, outside the private Barleti University. I'm here to meet Artan Shutaj. He's the vice rector and the professor of sports. But I'm more interested in his former job as the president of Albania Betting Association. Mr. Shutaj, did your association really try to stop the government ban on betting?
I went 3 times a day in the televisions trying to explain why betting activities were too many betting points, but we were ready to accept 1/3 of the betting points. We were ready to help the government to make more restriction. We could limit, we could prevent people that are sick, that has this kind of addiction, like other countries are doing. But stopping was, and I remain firmly convinced that it's not the best way to deal with the betting. But you are not banning the betting. They will find ways to prevail, they will find way to exist, and if you stop the legal part, you stop the control, but you don't stop the activity, which means that now the activity is done from the dark part of our society.
I'm on my way to meet Miri. He's a problem gambler and still bets, even though gambling has been banned. We have changed his name to protect his identity. All this
started this disgusting thing aged and has lasted 17 years.
Can you explain how different the gambling addiction is if you compare with our other addictions as well?
I think that this habit is more dangerous than alcohol because it has financial consequences as well. What gambling does to you is that you lose patience. 1 minute feels like 500 minutes. There are things which need time, but I've become a very impatient person. In the mornings I want to be alone, headache, anxiety, the need to be alone.
So how easy is for you to gamble from?
It's very easy to find places where I can play. The ban only caused a disruption of about a month for me. For the websites and the programs.
Did you gamble today?
Today I gambled a small amount, but today it's Tuesday, there's the Champions League, and probably I'll play again. Though the weekend is the big time for gamblers. During the Champions League, there are bigger chances to win, but in the end, it's the same story, we always lose.
And where?
I charged my account today. There are two ways to charge the account. Either you ring them and ask them to put money on it, or you just go physically to the place, hand over the money, and they do it so you can play. The weakest point for gamblers win, but if you bet live, you can bet on many things. For example, 3 goals in the first half, none in the second, so it's very easy to get it wrong. And this is also related to what I said before, the lack of patience. So we are not patient enough to wait 90 minutes for the result.
So tonight you are planning to go to a place and gamble. What is this place like?
There are two ways. Those who had betting shops, they still have them. Where the gambling happens might look like a bar, like a travel agency, like a regular shop. Maybe the people just drop in, maybe have a coffee or beer. Usually they just come and go. Other places you just go, hand over the money, they charge the account on your app. We go there just to play or place credit. If I want to watch a match, I would normally watch at home or with friends, not there.
What's like in these places? There's any alcohol, there's music, or people just chat with each other?
If important, might play a match. But in these special places, no more than 2 screens. People shout or swear, look at phones. Sometimes you ask from the organizers another phone. They have a few extra phones with accounts for those who don't have their own smartphones. Most of the process goes on the phones.
I arranged to interview Ervin Bushati, a member of parliament for the Socialist Party, leading the country from 2013. He supported the gambling ban, and I want to ask him whether it was the right thing to do.
We talked with the government, they proposed the law, and I was very much pro. I'm one of the economists in the parliament, and I also believe that gambling can be a nuisance or a problem, and it can become just not an economic problem, but also a social problem. All the data showed that it was huge, it was underground, and probably not controlled by clean hands.
So this was the main aim of this gambling ban? The fact that it was not in clean hands?
It was destroying families. It was having a tremendous or horrific effect on young people and people who could not stop. It was a lot of suicides and families destroyed because of gambling. We had the support of the majority of the people, even if you ask today and if you do opinion polls, more than 80% of the people were in support of closing all those activities. Obviously, there were a lot of pressure from the underworld, sending messages and threats to MPs and to the Commission.
You spoke about threats coming from the underworld. But according to Albanian law, all the people who had licenses in sport bettings, for example, or licenses in open gambling activity, those people didn't have any criminal record. So the law kind of like didn't allow people with criminal records to open a betting shop.
According to our data at the time, 85 to 90% of all the betting stations were controlled by 2 or 3 people from the underworld. So that was the right decision. I'm standing by it.
So what's happening now? People are still betting, but this time they are betting illegally. So all across the country, people have accounts where they can log in and they can bet online. And we don't know where the money that they bet go. So it seems that the legal sector, which was problematic in your opinion, now has turned into illegal one.
So what you're saying actually was one of the main points that people pro-gambling were bringing back at the time as an argument, which is not an argument for me. It's the same goes for opium trade. If we try to make opium or heroin illegal, we make it illegal, and it's not used everywhere. And if it's still some spots, I don't know if it's 1% or 2%, because you don't have the numbers. But still, I think that we nipped in the bud 99% of the problem. What I know is now that we stopped an illegal activity. Trading guns or trading heroin or trading whatever thing it's illegal, it can still go on underground. And if it's going on, it's illegal, and we'll do the same and try to stop it.
But also this money contributed to state budget. I mean, millions of euros every year will go to the state budget as a result of taxes that the gambling industry would pay.
Taxes is not the main drive behind the decision of a government. You can have taxes from opium if it was legal, but at some point you decide to stop it. There was not a lot of taxes. It was less than 45 million euros. And most of that, it was to control the problems that it caused. Lost lives, and you cannot put a price on life.
Hello, hi.
Hello.
This meeting is being recorded.
Thank you so much for all the investigations you've been doing. We've been listening to your interviews with such interest. They've been really, really remarkable. So I've got a variety of questions just to run through. The first one is, Ervin Bushati, the Socialist MP, stood by his decision to ban gambling. But after your investigation, do you think it's the right thing to do?
I believe that the ban was drastic. In a times where some alternative solution can be found, for example, reducing the number of betting shops and having a stronger control. At least in this way, the government could have saved some revenues coming from the gambling sectors. Some of this money could have been used to support sports or also tackle the problem of gambling addiction.
Ervin's point was that, well, when things are illegal, like heroin or guns, it's much easier to take action against those products when they're illegal products. Do you think that's right? And is that something that the Albanian government is now actually doing? Are they trying to clamp down on illegal gambling in Albania?
Not necessarily. I share the same opinion. I think you can better control things that are legal rather than illegal ones. Gambling is, in fact, a regulated industry in almost every country of the world. So you cannot really compare gambling with heroin trading and trafficking and other drug trafficking.
I think ultimately the success of the policy will be judged about whether there are fewer problem gamblers, less divorces, less suicides, less debt. Is there any evidence of that occurring?
The widespread electronic casinos and sports betting shops affected mostly people with lower income, but also minors. However, to this day, we don't have any survey or study to show the effects of the ban. The fact that still a big part of this activity is being conducted online, it doesn't really help to have a big picture if the ban was effective or not. So to this day, we really don't know if the ban was effective.
You've uncovered quite a lot of change in terms of moving to illegal forms of gambling, and it's linked with organised crime. And from what you've told us about that, it seems either way there's always going to be a problem in Albania with gambling and organised crime, regardless of whether it's legal or illegal. What do you think about that?
I think you are right. It is believed that only a small part of organized crime groups were engaged in the gambling industry. On the other hand, Albania has problems with illegal cannabis cultivation, for example, and drug trafficking in general. Money laundering also is a widespread crime. So the organized crime exists and will exist with or without gambling. But it's important to emphasize that now that we have a part of the gambling sector illegally conducted, is of course not good news for people and a really good one for criminal groups. As a result, we have an important stream of money not really knowing where it's going.
That was Fationa Magini. Thanks for listening to Gambling a Sure Bet. In the next episode, we're in the United States of America. We'll be looking at the battle going on between Native American tribes who are trying to keep gambling exclusively inside their casinos and the big multinational companies wanting to bring sports betting on smartphones into gamblers' homes.
FanDuel Sportsbook. There's no easier way to try sports betting risk-free. Get up to $1,000 back if you don't win your first bet.
Gambling a Sure Bet on the BBC World Service was presented by me, Dr. Heather Wardle, and was produced by Lydia Thomas. To listen to more episodes from this series, including the last episode where I look at Kenya's gambling industry, visit the World Service website and search for The Compass.
This is the BBC World Service, and this month's World Questions is looking at the future of work.
Since the pandemic hit, businesses have closed, livelihoods have changed, and for millions of people, home has become the office. I'm Katya Adler. Join me as our panel of experts debate the long-term impact on the world of work.
World Questions at bbcworldservice.com.
There's technology on its way this half hour here on the BBC World Service. I'm Gareth Mitchell. Today, cries for help on social media as doctors in India appeal for medical supplies and oxygen. As the COVID situation worsens in India, we're hearing how people are even turning to dating apps to appeal for help. Also today, Europe moves to regulate artificial intelligence and facial recognition and clamping down on illegal brick kilns in Bangladesh. It's all coming up on Digital Planet after the news.
BBC News. The number of confirmed coronavirus deaths in India exceeded 200,000 as the pandemic continues to surge across the country. The last 24 hours were the deadliest so far, with over 3,000 fatalities. Neighbouring Pakistan, which is looking on nervously at India's plight, has recorded 201 daily deaths, its most so far. The government is planning lockdowns from 10 cities or districts. The European Parliament has ratified the post-Brexit trade and cooperation deal with Britain by an overwhelming majority. It has been operating provisionally since January. France has arrested 7 former members of the ultra-left Italian Red Brigades, convicted back home of acts of terrorism committed in the 1970s and 80s. Police are searching for 3 others. Italy is seeking the arrest of 200 former brigade members, but France's policy is to deport only those convicted of murder. Iran's Foreign Minister says he's sorry that the leaking of an audio tape of him sparked domestic infighting. Mr. Zarif was heard criticising the power of the Revolutionary Guards in framing foreign policy. He said he hadn't expected the recording to be made public. The Somali president has moved to ease tensions in the capital Mogadishu by calling for fresh presidential elections. The British government says self-driving vehicles could be allowed on UK roads by the end of this year. The Department for Transport said automated lane-keeping systems would be the first type of hands-free driving legalised. And police in Japan have arrested the young widow of an elderly business mogul, accusing her of murdering her husband, who had dubbed himself the Japanese Don Juan. Saki Sudo was 22 when her 77-year-old husband, Kosuke Nozaki, was found dead with large amounts of a stimulant drug in his system, leaving his $28 million fortune in question. BBC News.
Hello everybody, I'm Gareth Mitchell. Welcome along to Digital Planets. Today, appeals for oxygen through the social media in COVID-hit India. Also, Europe moves to regulate facial recognition. And in Bangladesh, satellite imagery and machine learning are the tools to help clamp. Comment as we go along from technology experts. We need adequate medical facilities. So tweeted one doctor in India on Monday under the hashtag India needs oxygen. As COVID cases surge in the country, medics are on the social media appealing for oxygen and medical supplies. Other SOS messages come from those begging for hospital beds. Desperate people are posting their phone numbers. Basically, please call me if you can help. Meanwhile, it emerged on Friday that the government has issued takedown requests to the social media platform saying that certain posts are spreading panic and misinformation. But is that really more to do with silencing critics? And Anya Bhattacharya is a Mumbai-based tech reporter at the Quartz News website.
Yeah, so I think cases are rising at an alarming rate. You know, there's 350,000 plus daily cases every day. And we're seeing a lot of our healthcare kind of being tested. So it's not in the best shape and it's kind of exposing itself, I think is what the problem is, you know. So a lot of the times when people are trying to go to hospitals and secure beds or get medicines or get, you know, oxygen cylinders and things like that, they're quickly running out, and running, you know, post to post is not very easy. Physically, and then when you need certain things that where you don't know where to find them as well, online has kind of come up as a good platform for people to be able to seek out information quickly and regularly as well, because a lot of the times, you know, when you need these kind of supplies, you need them daily, or you need them you know, once a week, twice a week, so you can keep going back to a source where you can seek them out if your local pharmacy is running out or your local hospitals are running out of space and stuff like that. And I think it's also another aspect is that it's kind of leveling the playing field. So in a country like India, when you're trying to look for resources, often your clout and connections kind of come in use. The due process is not always followed, which is a disadvantage. But social media is kind of making that better, because at least you can put out your query and then hopefully you'll find a lead even if you don't have your own connections.
Yeah, because I've seen people tweeting, for instance, help, we need oxygen in this region or in this neighbourhood. You know, it's literally that kind of thing, cries for help across the social media.
It's definitely people who are putting out calls for supplies for oxygen, for calls for even, you know, medicines and plasma and hospital beds. But it's also working the other way, where a lot of doctors and hospitals are now joining the platforms, or, you know, using their platforms, which they might not have as much, to ask for left. They will tweet that out, and then that does kind of a twofold job. One is they might get leads in terms of where they can get the resources they're looking for, and the other is, you can hold people accountable. So if they tag their local politicians or they tag other, heads of other hospitals and things, maybe the network can kind of mobilize together, and everyone can help each other. That's the hope. The only danger I would say is, sometimes that information of oxygen available. Once
some of the dating apps are getting involved.
Yeah, I mean, you hear cases where people say things like they might have put in a request for a plasma donor in their Tinder bio, and obviously these are one-off things. I don't think it's all intentional, but it's just a good sign of how the internet kind of works together. There's also another dating app called Truly Madly in India, which has actually just launched a system to match plasma donors with patients. So they're using their kind of dating matchmaking algorithm to match plasma donors and patients. So, yeah, I mean, that's a quirk that we have seen, but I think those are definitely less useful than the other traditional platforms, I would say.
Yeah, of course. What about celebrities, though? Because in India, the Bollywood celebrities especially, are they wading in at all?
There definitely are a lot of people that are stepping up, responding to queries from people, trying to match people with beds in hospital, trying to find plasma donors, whether it's from Bollywood, or we have a lot of, smaller influencers like fashion influencers and other social media influencers who are creating COVID highlights, who are kind of sharing calls for help on their stories. And there are a lot of people kind of spreading this information, amplifying it. Of course, that's not always going to work the way you want it to. So the same danger that existed with having outdated information, say on Twitter, that same kind of danger exists on these platforms as well. But yeah, I think there definitely are people who are trying to at least keep up in real time as much as they can.
So what about other platforms then? We've spoken a bit about Twitter and even slightly some of the dating platforms. What about Instagram, for instance, WhatsApp? Are we seeing those being used?
WhatsApp is a hyper-local kind of reach. In terms of Instagram, definitely there is a different kind of crowd there as well. And there are a lot of, toolkits and a lot of infographics that are being shared and a lot of information pointing you to the right direction, rather than personal calls for help so much. And in terms of reach, if you look at it, so like a Facebook has over 400 million Indians using it. WhatsApp has more than 500,000. Instagram has 120 million. Twitter, on the other hand, has less than 20 million, but actually a lot of people prefer it just because it's text only, it's 280 characters, it's to the point, and it really helps kind of consolidate. And then Twitter also recently launched a tool that lets you do an advanced search, so you can filter by location, by time. So I think just in terms of efficiency, even though the other platforms are being used as well, they can have a lot more distractions than a Twitter does, which is why we mainly talk about Twitter when we talk about these kind of SOS messages.
Is there something of an information war breaking out here? Because I have read that the government's asked some of the platforms to take down certain social media postings that the government says are fueling panic, for instance.
Yeah, I think the report you're referring to is when Twitter was asked to take some 52 tweets down by, MLAs and celebrities and things like that. We don't really know exactly what it is, because you can say it's COVID handling, but Twitter has different views on their hate speech and other things as well. So I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what it was unless I saw all 50 tweets. But it is true. It is definitely true that the government has asked to censor some of the information around the pandemic kind of uproar. And it is a little bit, I think, to do with panic. I don't know if it is all to do with panic. Some of it might be to do with just dissent as well. We'd have to see the quality of the tweets and see what they said to be able to come to a conclusion.
That's Ananya Bhattacharya, and incidentally there is a special day of coverage across the BBC on Wednesday of India's COVID crisis. Well, Bill Thompson was listening to that, and Bill, also in the last few days we've seen Yogi Adityanath, Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, and he's basically been denying there's an oxygen shortage in the state, and he says the hospitals should be stopped from appealing for oxygen. So there's a real disagreement here, isn't there?
There absolutely is. I mean, I think we need to start by just saying how appalling the situation is and how much we feel for everyone in India and what they're going through. People are clearly desperate, and this is no way to manage public health, and there are failures in the system. And what we're looking at are people responding to that by using whatever tools they have available, which means increasingly social media, the network and stuff like that. But as we heard in the interview there, it's not necessarily always effective. Because it is an informal communications method, it's absolutely not the best way to manage this. But in this desperate situation, it's the only possible, it's the only way people have. And so what we perhaps need to think about is how all those involved can work to make it better, to make it more effective by coordinating more effectively and things. And in that context, having the government basically trying to take down certain messages claiming that it's because of public health, but at a time when they're being accused by some of prioritising their election campaigns over the need to challenge this, just creates such a difficult environment for everybody. From the outside, we don't really know what's going on, but the evidence is that there are oxygen shortages. They seem to be quite well authenticated, that these networks are the only effective way people have to draw attention to that, and it's working. And you would hope that you would see, government and officials want to support those methods and improve them rather than stand in their way or allow them to be, less efficient than they could be.
All right, Bill, thank you for that. We'll leave it there. As I mentioned, that special day of coverage on Wednesday this week. All right, moving on. Facial recognition by the police in public spaces is to be banned. Well, that's one headline in the new European Commission proposal to regulate artificial intelligence and related technologies. It'll be the first ever legal framework on AI. The Commission says that the rules will be friendly to innovation whilst also protecting citizens. The framework categorises AIs into different risk profiles, ranging from unacceptable risk to minimal. Remote biometric identification, kind of facial recognition and other technologies, that's in the high risk category, and the police will only be able to use it with a warrant or permission from a judge. Well, let's hear more on this from journalist Stephanie Hare. She's written widely on this issue, and I welcome back to Digital Planet, by the way, Stephanie. And I suppose the first question is how much this reminds us of GDPR. Are we seeing these proposed AI regulations as the artificial intelligence equivalent of GDPR for data protection?
That's certainly how it's being positioned a bit in the media, and I think it's both fair and missing the point. One of the things that's a really interesting way of understanding the difference is to look at something like facial recognition technology. That was covered as a biometric technology, which is data about your body is a biometric. That was covered under the GDPR. So loads of people thought that the GDPR would protect us from the abuses of facial recognition technology. And of course, that's not what's happened. So you could look at this new proposal as a way of saying the GDPR was a good first draft. It worked on data protection questions. Now, this next step is going much further and hopefully will offer other protections on other uses of technology, much more broadly, of course, than just facial recognition.
Right. And Stephanie, for want of a headline at the top of that item, I said facial recognition by police, it's going to be banned. But there are caveats to that in the regulations, aren't there?
There's so many caveats to that. So the idea would be live facial recognition, which is when the police would have cameras stationed on top of a police van, for instance, when they're out in a crowd. That, in theory, would be banned. There are exemptions, of course, in exceptional cases that would have to be signed off by a judge, it must be said. So let's say that there was an imminent terror threat, or unfortunately that a terror attack had occurred. The police could ask to use this technology under the provisions of this regulation, and a judge could sign off on it for a specific and limited time. Some people might be fine with that, by the way. Some people might not and say, no, this technology is too dangerous under any circumstances. But there's also the fact that you could just use facial recognition technology in all sorts of other ways that are not covered by this regulation, including the private sector, which is going gangbusters on it. So this regulation, for some people, will not go far enough, and I'm sure for law enforcement is going too far.
And also, I was reading in these in the proposals that, for instance, there won't be a ban on systems that detect gender, sexuality, race, or disability. Did you read it that way too?
Yes. That's another thing, because, what people are doing when they're analyzing your body data, your biometrics, when they're looking at things like sex, that doesn't sound like it's controversial until you realize that not everybody identifies their gender with their sexuality, right? So that's a factor. A lot of these technologies don't work very well on different colored skins. They tend to perform worse on darker colored skins than lighter. Super controversial to be looking at somebody's sexual orientation through facial recognition or any other technology, really. Why would you need to know that? And political orientation is crazy to me. I mean, that sort of technology is being used in China in this way with devastating effects.
Right, okay. And we'll bring Bill in a second, though. I suppose the practical question then, I'm just thinking about European citizens then walking around public spaces who in recent years may have been troubled at the idea that there are cameras surveilling them without their knowledge, doing facial recognition, matching them up on offenders' databases, all those kinds of things. If these regulations become law, will European citizens be able to worry a bit less about that, or indeed not at all?
Not necessarily, because the private sector and actually other forms of facial recognition in other ways, just not live in public spaces. So I would say, no, this is not a time to sort of relax and get complacent if you care about this issue.
But at least, Bill Thompson, they're writing some regulations around this and showing some evidence of taking this seriously. And they have said, look, it is a high-risk AI, so we're doing something about it.
They're starting to do something about it. I think first we should say that the European Commission is using the term artificial intelligence AI, so we are, even though we prefer the term machine learning ML. You take the vocabulary that you're given. The second is the point that Stephanie made so well, I think, which is that the assumption within there will be advanced facial recognition and biometric recognition dating do we actually think closer to the nuclear non-proliferation treaty as a global community?
Happening in the United States is far more complex. We're seeing entire facial recognition outright. And what's really interesting is that in the States, they're banning police use, whereas the private sector tends to get a pass in both sides of the Atlantic.
And what about in privately owned public spaces, if you know what I mean, in places like shopping malls, for instance? So they're not technically in
usually owned by private landlords. I mean, we had that here in the United Kingdom, you'll recall, 2 years ago in London's King's Cross. We found out that someone was using facial recognition for 22 months in secret. And it was only discovered because the Financial Times journalist broke the story, and the Information Commissioner's Office launched an investigation to decide if it was legal or not. And they still never, they haven't ruled. That investigation is ongoing 2 years later.
Okay.
So we don't know.
That's all right. We'll have to leave it there. Stephanie Hare, thank you so much for joining us. More from Stephanie in the podcast edition of this programme, and we'll hear more from Bill as we go along as well. All right, now, whilst Europe has been working on those AI and facial recognition proposals, researchers have been training algorithms to spot illegal brick kilns in Bangladesh. As the country's economy grows, so too does the demand for bricks. So kilns have been popping up around Bangladesh, and many are violating rules governing how close the kilns can be to places like schools and health centres. Inefficient coal burning contributes to the country's air pollution problem, and that's estimated to reduce Bangladeshis' average life expectancy by almost 2 years. So researchers are using deep learning computer architectures called neural networks to pick out illegal brick kilns from satellite images. They've just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. One of the team is Nina Brooks. She's a postdoctoral associate at the University of Minnesota, but she did the research whilst a doctoral student at Stanford University. And Nina says that some of the authorities are on the back foot.
The kilns are relatively easy to set up, and they're also quite profitable. And as a result, because there's such high demand for bricks, they're just popping up constantly, and sort of a game of whack-a-mole for the regulators to be, constantly tracking and finding where new kilns are being, without obtaining the permits or environmental clearance from the government. And so the difficulty is it makes it hard to enforce regulations that do exist and, of course, monitor compliance.
So you have these polluting and very unpleasant brick kilns. The challenge is, I guess, to locate and find them.
Yeah, so what we set about to do was develop a low-cost way to identify where all of the brick kilns were. To be used by the government or by civil society or even by citizens, to know and report that they're living near something that maybe shouldn't be there. The dominant sort of regulation that's on the books around brick manufacturing is really regulating where kilns can be constructed and the type of fuel that can be used. And so there are a lot of regulations that say kilns shouldn't be within certain distances of schools and hospitals because, of course, the air pollution is quite harmful to those populations. And also they shouldn't be close to, urban centers and human populations, which is quite hard to actually, put into practice in a country like Bangladesh because it's so dense. And so the kilns themselves are incredibly visually distinct. Everyone on our team knows, we've all looked at. It really lends itself to this sort of object detection approach because you can see them in satellite imagery.
Right, so you have satellite imagery of regions of Bangladesh in which you're training a neural network to identify these brick kilns then, aren't you?
Yeah, once you've looked at a bunch, then you sort of know exactly what you're looking at. But there are two main types of kiln technology, and so depending on the type of kiln, the sort of firing chamber is either an oval or a rectangle, and then you have the chimney, and then because the bricks are they're all molded by hand, it's quite labor intensive, and then they're stacked outside to dry in the sun before they're put in the kiln for firing. And so when you see the kilns, you'll also see rows and rows and rows of these, they're called green bricks, stacked outside of the kiln or nearby, drying in the sun. And so the whole sort of enterprise then becomes quite easy to detect in a satellite image.
And to help the listeners, you might have assumed that you would see the brick construction of the kiln and a chimney on it and stuff. It's not quite that clear, but from an aerial view, they appear. I've got one in front of me here, one of these aerial views, and they appear. Well, it just looks like a square of brown to me. I wouldn't have known that was a kiln, but you must be, you and your algorithms must have better trained vision than me.
So this sort of began as a pretty classic machine learning problem, and so we provided the algorithm with a set of training images that were labeled with whether or not the image contained a kiln or did not contain a kiln. We did a lot of steps along the way to really improve the performance of our algorithm. We found early on, because most of our training data was from one particular region of the country, which happens to be a region where myself and other collaborators, some of whom were on this project, are doing fieldwork, so we had the locations of kilns from that part of the country. But we found that the model was not really performing well in other regions of the country where maybe the topography or the imagery just looked a little bit different. So we ran a lot of experiments to sort of improve the performance of the model and see how it worked on imagery from other parts of the country, and did a lot of tweaking to really improve its performance. But one of the really sort of novel things that we added, since an image classifier itself is at this point now a relatively standard machine learning application, but we wanted to go beyond classifying whether or not an image contained a kiln or not, because that's not all that useful from a policy perspective. And so we actually wanted to locate where within the image the kilns were located. And one way you could do that would be actually generating all of that training data by pinpointing where the kilns within each image were located. But that would be a lot of work to generate that data. And so we used what's called a weakly supervised approach. So we didn't give the model information about where the kilns were located, but the model actually learned that itself. Simpler way to describe it is that we allowed the model to sort of identify the pixels that were really firing, the pixels that sort of indicated to the model that there's a kiln here. And then we did a few different steps to sort of isolate those pixels from the rest of the pixels in an image. And we then took that sort of centroid of all those kiln pixels, the ones that really said, hey, there's a kiln here, as the center of the kiln. And then from there, we were able to extrapolate the precise, latitude and longitude of the kilns. And so that's how we extracted the GPS coordinates from the images.
So what has this led to then? Have there been, for instance, any successful convictions of the less legal kilns as a result of this approach?
One of the things that we did in this analysis, sort of, after we ran the whole machine learning pipeline, generated all these coordinates, we identified, as you said, around 7. So we did do a check to compare our results to data that the government of Bangladesh has produced on brick kilns. We've also did a few analyses to sort of shed light on compliance with the existing regulations, by which populations in the country are exposed to brick manufacturing and the harmful byproducts. And it turns out, almost everyone in the country is somewhat exposed. Around 95% of people in the country live within 10 kilometers of a brick kiln. So sort of speaks to the challenge of trying to move them farther away from where people live. There's just nowhere to move them to.
That's Nina Brooks. So, Bill Thompson, a deep learning, not merely a machine learning approach there.
Indeed, and a very sophisticated one. There's so much to dig into this. There's so much you could make out of the raw clay of this material if you could fire it properly. You see what I did there?
I did.
Firstly, it's interesting. I had not realised that there's been quite a lot of research in the past into how to identify brick kilns from satellite imagery. The work builds on other work in this area. And I really read the original paper, the paper that's published online, and we can provide a link to it. Reading the whole thing, because what you learn is just how complicated it is to train a model, how much intervention it takes, how many steps there are, how much the researchers have had to do to assess different models, to assess the quality of the imagery that they had available, the satellite imagery, and to decide whether the cloud cover made it, how difficult the cloud cover made to identify whether it was a ziggurat kiln or a fixed chimney kiln. All of that is hidden in the story you hear that, we can identify kilns from space. Well, we can, but only because a bunch of very clever people did a whole load of work using computers. So this is not really a story about how the algorithm is great. It's a story about how scientific research works, how we take a bunch of techniques and technologies and enhance and improve them when we have a well-formed problem. And the well-formed problem is about human health. It's about helping save people's lives. And that drives people to work with these not very good technologies and make them better and find ways to deploy them to help public health officials on the ground. So this is much, much deeper than just, look, the computer can do a clever thing. It's clever people have shown the computer how to do something really useful in the world.
Yeah, that really cements it. Thank you, Bill. The studio manager is Duncan Hannant and your producer is Anya Literovich. We'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
This is the BBC World Service, where Dan Stevens with Martha Wash continues.
Hi, people like to call me the Queen of Clubland. I'm celebrating the pioneering women of New York's dance music scene. In part 2, how female vocalists had to fight to get credit for their work in the 80s and 90s.
Dan Stevens at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. This is the BBC World Service, broadcasting on Digital Radio Mondiale, and you can get all the latest news from the BBC 24/7 at bbc.com/news.
The BBC and Digital Radio Mondiale.